What's up, football fans? Lindsay Rhodes and Sam Bruckhouse with you now on the Sumer Sports Show. We've got some numbers to talk about, Sammy V, and they're the type of numbers that we don't typically talk about on this show, but they're a good framework for to evaluate, I think, how the market sees these teams. And those are the win total numbers, which came out last week. ESPN Bet was first to market, so we're going to use that as a framework for our conversation. There are some win totals here that I think are just fascinating to take a look at prior to the draft. How much do you anticipate, or does history tell us the draft could potentially change these numbers?
So first off, I love preseason win totals, mostly totally biased because this was the research that got me a job in analytics. I studied NBA win totals and their representation as connected to their network effects between players, a whole bunch of nerdy stuff, but they're always a really good indication, particularly pre-draft, of what we expect to happen. And moreover, the idea that the draft may or may not have that big of effect on the win total distributionally. Now, will some of these players end up being impact players? Certainly, but it's difficult to tell that until they actually start playing. And
Yeah.
so as a result, you can really get over as a betting corporation or as a prediction engine by simulating these distributions and understanding that a lot of these players are probably not even going to play at all, if a lot, and kind of getting advantage of people who really get excited about the draft and end up betting the over the under just based off the fact that they added a third round quarterback. And I think that understanding of the win totals really allows us to dive deeper and investigate, which is me and your favorite thing to do, Lindsay,
Yeah.
of why these teams are the way they are and what assets that they currently have, what assets that they can use lead into this valuation.
Yeah, I mean, and we'll discuss as we go kind of some of the things that factor into these numbers. Strength of schedule is a big one, certainly with regards to one team in particular, and we'll get to that. I mean, obviously, a lot of different teams have strength of schedule factored in, but one I think got a major boost because of that. But you mentioned third round quarterback drafting, and then people going back and betting over or under based on that. What about a first round quarterback? Is that like, will that, if somebody does get one of these top two quarterbacks and it looks like there's an opportunity for them to start right away, what kind of change do you see that potentially making to a win total? Much?
So it's still difficult to really gauge. In my research history, it's still probably not that big of a difference. We were looking at draft curves the other day, just comparing particularly across sports. And the NFL has a pretty flat draft curve, meaning that it's very difficult to get any surplus value at all at any given point in time. Obviously, you can get it primarily at the top of the draft. And so if we're talking about Cameron Ward, or we're talking about Shedeur Sanders, or if Jackson Dart or some other quarterback jumps up into the first round, particularly in the first, 5 to 7 picks, that's an indication that they're probably going to make a very, very slight difference. Like I'd still, frankly, like it's still probably a negative over average or a negative over replacement number, but that being said, it does kind of switch the idea of what the team might do, how the team might approach the season. I'd be shocked if the win total moves a ton other than for market reasons. But it's really tough to gauge these guys, particularly at the quarterback position. Yes, first 5 picks, quarterbacks will have more value than if you select any other position, but it's still on that distribution. And it's not going to be, a $40 million value swing up into the Jared Goff level, which we don't even think of that high, Lindsay. But that's like a pretty good starting quarterback salary. It's going to be more of like maybe at best a $6 to $7 million swing, quote unquote, in terms of the value you're getting, which means expect backup quarterback play.
Well, so all of this is actually, I wanted to start at the top of the win totals, but this is leading me to start closer to the bottom because I think that this conversation kind of takes us to the Giants to a degree.
Right.
And some of the conversation that we've had in the last week since they signed Russell Wilson, which I was surprised by. Last week, we talked on the podcast when we did this at the beginning of the week last week. We knew that we were looking at Jameis, and we talked about the fact that that led us to believe that they were probably thinking that they were going to draft a quarterback at number 3. Since then, they brought in Russell Wilson.
Mm-hmm.
That was a move that surprised me simply because I thought I mean, it seems silly to say what's the difference between Jameis and Russell. Like there's obviously historically in terms of their careers been a pretty big difference at this point in time in terms of boom and bust and like their ability to kind of do really good things versus things that hurt your team. I don't know that they're that dramatically different. I don't know if you agree with me, but it seems like we brought in two veterans, which would seemingly cross out the first round quarterback at least. And to me, tells me one of two things is true. Either they decided that Shedeur Sanders was not somebody that they wanted to take with the number 3 overall pick, or they're convinced that Shedeur Sanders is not going to be available, meaning that the two quarterbacks go 1-2 and that they're out of the mix for those two things. Before I get into the next layer of this particular conversation, do you think it tells us which one of those two are you leaning towards?
So I don't think that you can lean on Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston at all to be more than an average starter this year. And I think what they're trying to do is just get over that average starter hump right now, and they're willing to take any shot that they can to do that. And I think the decisions that they made to go with Russell Wilson, who was very good at long accuracy last year in terms of our long accuracy Sumer scores, Lindsay, is trying to optimize on the fact that they have Malik Nabers at least for a year. Same thing with Jameis Winston, who obviously accuracy is less of substantially more of his problem, and decision making is questionable. Excuse me, like decision making as we like to look at it, which is how long are we pushing the ball down the field. He's going to get it to Malik Nabers. The ball is coming to Malik Nabers. We've seen him do that with Jerry Jeudy. We've seen him do that with Rashid Shaheed and Chris Olave when he was in New Orleans. The ball will be going to Malik Nabers if Jameis Winston ends up getting snaps. Contrary to Russell Wilson, accuracy is probably going to be a little bit more of a problem there. So it seems as if, number one, they're trying to optimize on Malik Nabers and just making sure that he's happy no matter what through a myriad of quarterbacks. I still have this massive question mark, though, about like what they can truly expect. And if you're a data scientist like me and you like to stick to the consensus and you understand kind of all the things I laid out at the beginning of the pod, which is that it's kind of a toss up once you start getting out of the first 7 or so picks, you're really making a massive bet for next year and the year after that if you're going to try to lean on a third round quarterback. Now, you will have a draft pick next year, but are you going to be there for that draft pick? If they lose a ton of games and they're in the Arch Manning conversation next year, is Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll still there? So there's kind of like a weird subset of interplay here of you want to make sure Malik Nabers is getting fed. You want to make sure you have a lot of options to keep your job, but you have to do so by winning games. And I think that's what they're kind of trying to do with getting players who have won games or at least been around 500 in Jameis and Russell Wilson. And then also adding a quarterback somewhere. I still would advise probably still trying to get a quarterback. But I can understand the flexibility that they've given themselves.
But you're saying when you say try to get a quarterback, you're saying at some point, you're not saying at 3, right?
I still think the most prudent, if you're just trying to win long term, I still think the most prudent thing, just based on what we've seen of where people are ranked in EDPs, it's still probably prudent to go with Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward, whoever is available. It seems like it's going to be Shedeur Sanders at 3, or if you get a chance to trade back and take him at 6 or 7, I still think that's prudent.
One of the
I
things,
think they've bought themselves the flexibility to go on a Jackson Dart or a Jalen Milroe or someone, though.
Yeah. I would be shocked personally if they committed this amount of resources to bring in quarterbacks this offseason, which I mean, all of your points are obviously well taken. Like you have to all of the bites at the apple, but particularly when the bites are like what we have available to us, right? Like none of these guys are people that are moving the needle. Hence, by the way, where we're going to go with this conversation, they have a 5.5 win total according to ESPN Bet. So like we're not looking at, and I mean, that's one of the lowest win totals in the NFL, not surprisingly. But I do think that it's an interesting layer of this conversation. One of the things that I'd kind of thought was because their jobs are all on the line, they have to win right now, that they might go with the rookie quarterback because that would buy them some time, a little bit of leash. If the rookie quarterback comes in and they look good, then it feels like it opens things up. Fran Duffy put out a really, really good tweet last week that just killed that narrative that I admittedly had kind of bought into. Just like ripped it to shreds. So I want to just reiterate some of the points that he made here. It's actually just a list, and that's all you need here. Rookie quarterbacks and what happened to their coaches after year one. Caleb Williams, most recently, fired head coach and OC after year one. 2024, last year, Drake May, fired head coach and OC after year one. The year before, Bryce Young fired GM, head coach, OC after year one. 2021, Trevor Lawrence fired head coach and OC after year one. Baker Mayfield was the first overall pick, fired the head coach and the OC after year one. Sam Darnold in 2018 fired GM, head coach, OC after year one. Mitch Trubisky fired head coach and OC after year one. Jared Goff with the Rams fired head coach and OC after year one. Like, it goes back. Jameis Winston, Marcus Mariota, Blake Bortles, all these guys taken in the first round, early in the first round, 1.1 to 1.3 is what we're looking at for all of those names. And all of them led to a head coach and an offensive coordinator or general manager being fired after year one. So I think to a degree, it kind of feels like the whole get a rookie because it buys you time obviously is not true. Obviously, we're not buying anybody time. And even if in the case of some of those guys, they looked good, maybe a little bit. Well, not many of those guys looked good after year one. Drake May, but you're just kind of looking at it and going, well, let's give this to somebody else who's a little bit more competent in some of these situations. And that could very well play out that way. So I think that that's interesting to keep in mind. That historical data when we're talking about the Giants situation also might actually just be smarter in the short term, not even thinking about the long term in terms of keeping their jobs, to give it to somebody who can maybe get them to 8 wins or something like that. Like, you're not going anywhere, but I don't even know that accomplishes anything. I don't know that anything accomplishes anything, is I guess what I'm getting at, hence the 5.5 win total.
Right. And I think there's a lot of people, when people use the term selection bias, I always get angry because it's like, well, duh, there's selection bias. It's football. Like, it's set up to have selection bias. But it turns out that when you are really bad and you draft very early in the draft, you're probably going to be bad again, which we can see a lot of that in these win totals here, where the teams like the Browns and the Giants and the Jets are all really high up there. And so the idea that you're going to flip your team into a playoff team in 1 year is highly improbable, and historically is highly improbable. And that's probably going to lead you to losing your job. Like, the situation that you have gotten yourself in is probably not going to improve like mightily. And so, like, when we really deeply look at it, it's tough to say that, like you said, that anything is going to change. And then I think you can soothe yourself into saying that, as a general manager, to saying, oh yeah, we're going to bring in Russell Wilson. He led a good team with Mike Tomlin. Well, they were a good team because they had an O-line that was okay. They had a very veteran defense that performed at an immensely high level with 3, 4, 5 stars across the defense. And they really led them for most of the season. And as a result, like, what was Russ really doing at the end of the season to have them win? And it was a similar story when he was in Denver, and both of those teams decided to let him go. So what's it going to look like in a worse situation? Probably not all that good. Similar point with Jameis. Like, Jameis played a couple of games, but now that team is drafting right behind, right in front of you at pick 2. And so I think as a data scientist, and again, there's so many other political things, and I recognize that, and there's so many scouting eye test things that we can't necessarily quantify, and I fully admit that. But if you are trying to shoot for the moon and trying to win games and trying to spread the distribution away from that win total of 5.5 into, a 5% probability of winning 10 games rather than a 2% probability, I think that's worth the shot.
How many wins do you think Jayden Daniels was good for last year? Like, just in terms of looking at it from a math standpoint. I don't actually know, as I'm framing the question, I don't know what their win total was going into the season. And that would help us tell this story, right? Because if we knew what we were looking at going into the season, and then we do know how many games they ended up winning. I would
Yeah.
point the finger at him, at least for a lot of those.
So Jaden Daniels is obviously like the best case scenario. Like he was in the MVP talks for most of the years. And so you look at, according to NFL ELO, which is something that I like to test here, he was worth about a point to the spread, meaning that like over an average starter, if he would have gone out and they would have replaced him with Marcus Mariota, who he was behind, who feels like an average starter, they would have actually lost a point in the spread. And so you look at some of our more key metrics internally at Sumer, and it seems like he was worth like a win or two, which makes sense. You know, over the course of 17 games, you add 17 points, that's a couple of touchdowns, that ends up being like 2 wins. So like that's the really, really high end. But I did a piece, which you can go back and look on sumersports.com, about like who the average starter for a first round selection is, over going back all the way to 1999. And it was like Aiden O'Connell in his first year. And Aiden O'Connell wasn't even a first round pick, which is the irony here. Mitch Trubisky comes to mind as well, of like some guys who played a lot of snaps, had some success, but the team wasn't immensely successful. And it ends up being like you're kind of a negative in terms of the point spread when everything gets shuffled up. So that's kind of it's a very, very large distribution, as you can tell, like 0 wins from one player or negative wins from one player, all the way to two total wins, which is the difference sometimes between winning a division and not winning a division, is like a massive gap. And I think you just try to do everything you can to spread that distribution if you're already on the hot seat.
I mean, they won 12 games. So I would think, and you're throwing out numbers there, and you're saying that those are high numbers, and I understand that from a math standpoint in terms of the averages and whatever. I would say he has to have been worth more than that, though, right? Like because there's no way the Commanders, in the situation that they were going into the season without Jaden Daniels, get anywhere near 12 wins unless Jaden Daniels is their quarterback and playing the way that he played, based on the other options that they had available to them. No,
yeah, I mean,
you don't think so?
This is one of the great problems in football. And to pull back the curtain a little bit, this is something that everyone in this industry is working on right now. And whoever figures it out is going to be the winner to move football into a place like baseball or basketball. And that's how to divide credit. Because you can say to me, oh, yeah, Terry McLaurin had an excellent year because of Jaden Daniels. But also Terry McLaurin had an excellent year. Like he was one of the best players. He was borderline All-Pro, Pro Bowler as well. One of Stopsky's favorite players, Sam Cosmi. You can say like that offensive line had a great year because of Jaden Daniels, but they were really a pretty effective rushing team. And then even worse yet, something we really can't quantify, how much did Dan Quinn and Cliff Kingsbury make a difference?
Yes. Yeah.
And so that's why that number, you know, like as an analyst in my head, 2 wins is like mind-boggling. But you're 100% correct. It's almost like adding Jaden Daniels into the puzzle of all those other shifting factors, primarily Dan Quinn and Cliff Kingsbury, and some of the big, massive changes they made on the defense, including Bobby Wagner being added to the team, who ended up making an All-Pro for better or worse. Frankie Louvu, Dorrance Armstrong, who had an excellent year. It like chips the marble a little bit to where we can't figure out where the cornerstone is. Seems like Jaden's the cornerstone. And so when we regress it all together and try to bring in that uncertainty, it ends up becoming 2 wins. But the linkage between Cliff Kingsbury and Jaden Daniels is certainly valuable as well. The linkage between Jaden Daniels and Terry McLaurin and Brian Robinson, all these guys, is certainly, there's value in the middle as well. So that's kind of the way that all comes together.
You could easily make the argument that all of those people could have been there, done a great job. And if Jaden Daniels, that last piece to the puzzle that also needs them to have done all their job, but if he weren't there, they're not sniffing 12, right? Like they could still do a good job and they're not going to get there. Their win total, by the way, preseason last year was 6.5, 6.5, and they got to 12. Wild. But you do make a good point. Everything there was different. I mean, ownership, right? Like even just alleviating them from that, like, and all of the stuff that goes along with that changes all of the different dynamics. So that's a really interesting one. So the Commanders win total this year is 10.5. That is the second highest number. 11.5. There's 4 teams that sit at that number. It's the Eagles, the Chiefs, the Bills, and the Ravens. personally, I don't think any of those are even that interesting to discuss because I think that that's exactly where you would expect them to be. Those are the teams that you would expect to be there. I think that next tier does have a couple of interesting notes that are attached to it, though. The Commanders, who are at 10.5, coming off a 12-win season. And then the other three teams that are at 10.5, I think are fascinating. One in that the Lions are there at 10.5, coming off a 15-win season. So that is the second biggest drop that is expected. The Vikings are projected to win 5.5 games less than they did last year. We'll talk about them in just a minute. But so you've got the Lions expected to come back down to earth to a degree. It's still a very good number. And then you've got two teams here that did not have particularly good seasons last year. One that had a not good season at all, that are also sitting at 10.5 wins. And I want to talk about them. The Niners, who won 6 games, are at 10.5. And the Bengals, who won 9 games last year, had the 16th best record in the NFL. They're also at 10.5.
So I think the through line of all these teams, sans if you want to make the argument of San Francisco and Detroit, which are very interesting, all of them have what we would call elite quarterback play or elite continuity. Again, Jalen Hurts notwithstanding, but Jalen Hurts has been excellent for years at this point, or at least in that ecosystem has been excellent. And so like it makes sense for KC to have a high win total. They have Patrick Mahomes. It makes sense for the Bills to have a high win total. They have Josh Allen. Same for the Ravens.
Yep.
The 10.5 are all immensely interesting, as you said. San Francisco is by far the most interesting because I expected last year a regression from them, mostly because of the injuries, which ended up happening. Ayuk tears his ACL. McCaffrey's out with some strange Achilles injury all year. Trent Williams misses some games. George Kittle misses a game here and there. And then the defense is in shambles. Hufanga misses a lot of games. I think the point that the win totals or the simulations or whatever the traders are trying to make here is that they probably went too far into their left tail last year. Like the worst literally did happen last year. And I think that's a fair point to say. And they're leaning on the fact that they have a lot of top all-pro talent on their team. Brandon Ayuk has made an all-pro team. Nick Bosa has made an all-pro team. Trent Williams made an all-pro team. Christian McCaffrey. Like these are all excellent players. And if you are to believe that Brock Purdy is an above average quarterback and not everything breaks the wrong way, they're probably going to end up being a pretty good team as they were in past years. Here's the point that I want to make that I think is interesting. Because like we've talked a lot about Hufanga, probably more than any podcast out there, about his impact on the team. And it kind of exemplifies the rest of the losses they had. Charvarius Ward, Drake Greenlaw, so forth and so on. When they lost him 2 years ago, they still made the Super Bowl. And I think what the 49ers viewed it as, and probably their detailed analytics department, which they have one of the bigger ones in the league. And then also what the traders are looking at is, okay, they didn't lose any of the players who make up their point total on a game-to-game basis. If any of the single Dre Greenlaws, Charvarius Wards, Hufanga, Aaron Banks was out, it wasn't going to affect the point total at all. So if they're replacing them with an immense amount of draft capital and any of those players are fairly okay, it's probably not going to affect them from the year before and the year prior. And I actually like that approach. I still think 10.5 is a little high. And I understand there's other market factors at play in order to, get the VIG and split the lines and so forth and so on. But I do understand the thought process into making it that number.
Yeah, they do have, as you mentioned, the 5th most draft capital. They've got 7 picks in the top 150. So they've got a lot of room to find replacements for some of the players that they lost. The assumption being that not all of them will hit and be like starter caliber players, but maybe they have some guys on the roster there who can make sure that I think your point about the guys that really swing the line anyway, like, certainly the quarterback. I don't know how much any of these other guys actually swing the line, but certainly like from a positional value standpoint, we've all agreed are important to your success. You've got your edge, you've got your left tackle, you've got your, I guess wide receiver, like one at least, like they do lose Debo. But I think maybe the most important factor here is their strength of schedule. And their strength of schedule is the easiest in the NFL going into the season. We don't know when they're playing everybody, so that will kind of change to a degree in terms of
Mhm.
like the way that some of these games string together and make it more complicated or easier. But in terms of just opponents played, their strength of schedule is the easiest going into next season. But I think that begs a question, a conversation that we can have here about how, like, if you're coming off 6 wins, and even if you revert to a mean of,
Mhm.
what you had the year before, and you assume that last year, like, they had all the bad luck, let's say. And so we're gonna get a couple more wins back just by kicking that open. Um, then you look at the schedule, and I wonder if we can try and come up with 10.5 wins here, because I think that they're giving them some wins that I don't know are gimmies for this team. And I'm wondering if we agree about that. They obviously have the NFC West schedule. So they play all these teams twice, and that's the Cardinals, the Rams, and the Seahawks. I think the Rams got better. I don't know how, I don't know that the Seahawks did. Cardinals on the defensive side of the ball added a few pieces. What kind of, you know, record do you think that we should assign to them against these three teams, just to kind of try and get to a win total here?
I think if you're thinking about it distributionally, the Rams probably overachieved last year, but like you said, they're bringing back a defense that had a bunch of 22-year-olds and we're still like, they weren't totally above league average, but they were pretty good. And they had 2 players in Fisk and Verse that were absolutely disruptive. And I wouldn't expect them to not progress, And so I think the Rams, like, I guess the point is you could say that they could split with any of these teams with the talent they have. I think they're more likely to sweep the Cardinals at the most likely to sweep. I
Okay.
think the Seahawks is going to be interesting. I want to see how they play, but I could definitely see that being a split just because it's hard to win in Seattle. But I think 4 wins or 5 wins is possible. I think they're definitely dropping. Like, I personally think it probably makes more sense to split with the Rams and the Seahawks than it does with the Cardinals. And so that
Okay.
would be what,
Let's give them 4 wins then there.
yeah, that would
And
be like
we
4
give
wins.
them splits, and then we give them 2 wins against the Cardinals. To be honest, I think that this is probably generous in terms of just
Mhm.
what you would assume right now. Like, we're
Right.
assuming a sweep. I don't know that that is, we don't have any evidence that the Niners are going to be that good again.
Yeah.
So, so doing that. Then other teams that they have at home, I will say they face some of the teams that, in terms of win total, they're like just checking boxes from the bottom up. Like, these
Mhm.
are the teams that they face. They've got the Titans at home. They've got the Jaguars at home. They've got the Panthers at home, the Bears at home, and the Falcons at home. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's 5 teams there. How many? I don't know if like a game against the Panthers next year is a gimme.
Yeah,
You
it
would
feels
think
like if
2 years ago that would have been the case, but
right, it feels like if you have to put something on the line, it's probably a victory against the Panthers, the Jags, and the Titans. Like, if you really have to put, feet to the brimstone or whatever. I
not the
think the
Bears.
Panthers, uh yeah, I like, and also with the Bears. The issue with the Bears is talking about increasing that right tail. The Bears have done everything to increase, like, their, like, flatten out their distribution. They've taken shots on guards. They've moved in on defensive players, and they're trying to set everything up well for Caleb Williams. And they have a moderate amount of draft capital as well. That's probably not going to move the needle. 10, 39, 41 at the top end. And again, I do want to note, like, when we're talking about draft capital here, we're speaking in terms of like the curve. The one that's used by Tankathon is the Harvard Sports Analytics curve. I've used that one to build up my personal research as well. So, like, we're not saying, oh, they just have a lot of picks. We're saying they have high value picks.
Yeah.
I guess you'd probably have to chart down the Bears as well, but that would be the 4th most likely. And then the Falcons,
Bears are
like,
at 8.5 wins, by the way. They gave
yeah.
them 3.5 more wins. That's a pretty big increase.
Yeah, and that's another thing I want to note about these win totals is, like, we see the win totals from last year, but what the models are seeing is, and I talked about this, I taught some classes at Tulane on Thursday of last week. What the models are looking at is like point differential, and Pythagorean win theory, for example, which the Bears like were expected to win based on those, totals, like 2 to 3 more games than they actually won. And so like that's the things we have to keep in mind. I know we're going to talk about the Vikings in a little bit. Same thing with the Vikings in past years. And so that's why the Bears, it's a little bit like, I don't know, like could they have won some of those games where it got weird at the end of the game? And then the Falcons are obviously the one where the Falcons almost made the playoffs last year. I think they were probably in a similar strength category last year. If they have their guys, they'll beat them. If they don't have their guys, they'll probably lose.
So let's give them 4 wins there at home.
Yep.
That's out of 5. I think that's generous.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see. And then the away teams that they play the Browns. I'm going to give them a win there.
Yep.
Without even thinking twice. They play the Giants. I'll give them a win there. Mm-hmm. They play the Texans, Colts, Saints, and Bucks.
So Colts feels like the victory there, and that gets us to 10, right? I'm not 9, great 10, at
that gets us to 11.
Yeah. And so
because we gave them 4 in the NFC West, we gave them 4 out of the other 5 home games, and then giving them the Browns, Colts, and Giants gets us to 11.
Yeah, and so if you're looking at that as like the 75th percentile outcome, which I think feels pretty safe, the number probably feels like 9.5 to 10, a little bit more, but it's a reasonable number, shockingly.
You know what's an interesting way of looking at this? The flip way. Like, who's definitely going to beat them? Like, or at least like is absolutely, we are confident going to be in a dogfight against them. And I cannot find a team outside of the Rams.
Yeah.
So that's actually interesting because the Falcons could beat them. The Panthers could beat them. The Texans could beat them. The Saints could beat them. The Bucks could beat them. Maybe the Bucks. Maybe I'll put the Bucks in that conversation too. Rams and Bucks, right? Those are the 2 where we're like, those are good games. Like the rest of them are like, our conversation is based on the fact that the Niners were not good last year. And so a 6-win team, how much can you guarantee that they're going to beat these teams? But there's no one on their schedule. Absolutely no one that is absolutely for sure. Like they're not playing the Bills. They're not playing the Chiefs. They're not playing any of those teams. That's wild.
Yeah. I think when you're getting to the spot where you're saying there's 3 teams that if they played to the level they did 2 years ago with a similar roster, ?
Yeah.
That could even hang with them. That's why the number is the way it is.
All right. So that is the Niners. What about the Bengals? Bengals are expected to win more games than they did last year. Now, again, it's not that much because they were at 9 and the total is 10.5. I think that the reason that I pointed out this was the 16th best record last year is because of the way that these numbers work at this time of year. You're not like somebody's going to get to 14 wins or 13 wins, but like nobody is projected to win that many games. So in terms of averages, we're putting them in a group that they were not in last year. They do have the 17th pick. They've got 6 total picks. They changed out their defensive coordinator. Did they make enough changes on the defensive side of the ball in order for us to really, expect massive strides there? Or are we just assuming that this is a team that's going to outscore teams in high scoring games?
So this one was interesting to me because like you're looking at their Pythagorean win total, you're looking at some of their ELO numbers, and they were pretty spot on to what they actually won last year, which is nine or so games, and so what you're hoping for is a progression from the dregs of the NFL at the defensive side of the ball. They had an excellent offense. Joe Burrow was an MVP candidate. The guy, again, like going back to what we've been saying, the guys who swing the line, they have back, which is why their total is so high. So their floor.
So far, we'll see if Trey's there.
Yeah, their floor is high just because of Burrow and Chase and Higgins. The question becomes, can that defense do anything? Like if that defense is the 15th best defense, is that 2 more wins? And so I don't know. I mean, like they were terrible last year and they've gotten arguably worse. And so it's like, a toss up. You look at their draft capital right in the middle, 22. Like even if any of those players would swing the metric or would swing the spread, like let's say they hit the top 5th percentile there, they probably don't have that many shots at it. And so that one is a tough number, but I think the reason why it is because you have MVP and Offensive Player of the Year candidates out on the field, as far as we know.
Yeah, defensive player of the year candidate too, so long as Trey Hendrickson is back, which, you know, who knows. Now this brings up an interesting conversation about the draft for them. And I mentioned they have the 17th pick. So that's what we're looking at here in the first round in terms of grabbing somebody that you absolutely are going to plug on into the starting lineup right away and cross your fingers that you get starting level production. They need a starting guard. They need to get a starting guard out of the draft. They also, in my opinion, very much need somebody to put on that line that can rush the passer in addition to Trey Hendrickson. And this is assuming that he is back.
Yep.
So what do you prioritize there at 17? How do you approach? I mean, it's never a good thing, in my opinion, if you are projected to win 10.5 games to absolutely go into a draft with needs. Like there are a lot of these teams that we're talking about in this range that don't have needs. They're going to be able to draft best available. The Bengals, I think, have needs. So how do you go about prioritizing what you need to get and win?
Every time I've done a mock draft, I'm like, man, the Bengals are lucky this year because there's going to be 4 edge rushers that should be available that are all around the 17th consensus pick. That if you think about the process and you think about the flatness of the curves, are probably distributionally going to be as good as some of the top players that end up going. And there's like 4 of them there. There's James Pierce there. There's going to be one of the Georgia edge rushers there. There's going to be one of the small school guys like Mike Green available. And then if you consider some of the guys who are later, Donovan Ezaraku, some of these guys all going to be available there at 17. And it's just like, great, we'll pick the one we like the best. And so it kind of, at that selection, luckily for the Bengals, kind of ends up going with the most talented player available just because of the way the draft plays out. And it's the same way at 49. There's going to be a ton of good interior offensive linemen that should be available around the 49th pick. I say good. They're going to be second-round players, but they're going to be certified second-round players. And that's a great place to pick a guard in the second round because then we're caring less about positional value. We can work a little bit more within the confines of pick the best player available with no positional value, as you wouldn't probably in the first round. And so they're just really lucky this year because it feels like it's going to fall perfectly for them unless something heats up much closer to the draft. But I don't expect that to happen given the amount of edge rushers and the amount of interior offensive linemen that will be available in the first 2 days of the draft. 17, 49, 81. They can probably just bang, 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 draft the best consensus available, which they typically do, and kind of fill up on these good players that just so happen it's a lucky draft to have the needs that they do.
Good answer. All right, so those are the 10.5 win teams. Do we need to talk about the Lions? Do you think the Lions are interesting that they're projecting them to come back down so far from 15 to 10.5?
I don't know. I think if I think this is probably a representation of Jared Goff more than anything.
You know what? Is that fair? I mean, I understand.
That's a great question.
Because I mean, like, pull up, like, I mean, pick a stat, pick one. You know what I mean? Like, it's like he's up there. Like, so I understand that we do not look at him and see elite quarterback, but it's hard to find many stats that suggest we're not getting elite level play out of him. So whether or not, going back to the Commanders conversation, credit distribution, like how much of that is environment, how much of that is the pass catchers, how much of that is, well, by the way, offensive coordinator loss could actually be a factor here. We have not seen them, and he is a guy that I think at the very least, we think, even if we're getting elite level play, we think it's conditional to a degree, right? Like he wouldn't give you elite level play anywhere and in any environment. So I think maybe is that what we're seeing here? The loss of Ben Johnson?
Yeah. As I was talking about the quarterback, it seems as if their personnel is actually the most stable thing, probably more than any team on here,
Yeah.
sans maybe the Buffalo Bills and the Eagles. The real talking about those network effects that I researched at the very beginning in the NBA, and I'd love to do this for the NFL at some point. The connections between the offense coordinator, defense players, quarterback, head coach, they are probably the most shattered of any team that is even. I mean, I'm looking.
Yeah.
The Bucks still have a similar thing. Liam Cohen obviously gone. And that's pretty much it. Pretty much everyone is the same. I guess you could say Philadelphia Eagles with Kellen Moore, but we've seen them successfully navigate offense coordinator changes before. They're
Well,
really the only team that lost both.
who have we seen take that has lost an offensive coordinator where you're like, oh man, look at how bad they are without that offensive coordinator? Can you think of any examples off the top of your head? I mean,
I mean,
wasn't the case for the Bucks.
yeah, I mean, we've seen people upgrade, which is interesting. Like I'm thinking about the Ravens going from bringing in Todd Monken, for example. There was a big upgrade there. It's a good question. I mean, like you can make the argument with the Bucks as well, particularly just in the running game, but they still had an excellent passing offense. It's a great point to. Oh well, I guess the Texans would be the one. Obviously, they didn't switch, but like a lot of the blame, if you were to read the ESPN reports for their regression this year, went to Bobby Slovic. So there's a couple of items here that come up. I guess you could say the same thing about the Seahawks, but that was a full tide shift, even though they had a lot of the same personnel. So it's tough really to say. The Steelers, I guess, as well, back in the day when they had Matt Canada, switch to him. But it's a good point that sometimes the quarterback just does matter more. And if you are to believe what we've seen, which last year, same NFL ELO stat, which puts stuff in terms of the spread over an average starter, which you would expect to be around a 0 or slightly negative point spread. Like Jared Goff was like 4 or 5 points better just in terms of his descriptive performance. So it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense for them not to be in that top class if you are to just review the personnel. I kind of agree with you on that one.
I'm curious. I'm going to pose this question to Twitter right now and see if anybody else can come up with any names of people. And if you're watching right now and you can think of an offensive coordinator that left and then the offense just tanked because of that, or at least partially because of that, go ahead and put that in the chat because we'd love to be able to have that conversation in a more educated fashion. Moving on, though, for the time being, the 9.5 win teams. I don't think there's that much here that's particularly interesting. This is where I would roughly expect all of these teams to be, and that's the Bucks, the Rams, the Chargers, the Texans, the Packers, and the Broncos. Anyone jump out to you in that group?
So if you're just considering the flip side of the coin of the 49ers, the Broncos had one of the lowest win totals last offseason, and they end up doing really well. Probably mostly because their defense and also because Bo Nix avoided bad EPA plays. So if you were looking to one that probably didn't fit, just based on that, I would probably say the Broncos. Now, they did add a lot to their defense. We'll see what they end up doing in the draft. I don't think 24th in total draft capital available. And again, that has like pick importance and historical pick value in it. So their team's pretty locked right now. You know, if you're betting on a team that shouldn't belong in this class, it feels probably like the Denver Broncos.
Broncos are, I think, interesting in terms of the whole Bo Nix situation.
Mm-hmm.
And like, what does that look like in year 2? And because he is somebody, and I've said multiple times that it's hard to find an advanced stat where he really excelled or was at the top of the list. There are actually, since then, I found a few playing around in Sports Info Solutions, and there are some. God, what was the one that I found for him that I thought was fascinating. Anyway, there are some where he is at the top, and then there are others where he's like pretty close to the bottom. And so how he looks after one more year of development, I think will be a fascinating story to follow this season. Because the Broncos, I think as a just general offseason storyline, I think you and I have talked about this around free agency. Like they're not a team that really just jumps off the page at you as having a ton of needs. Like
Right.
it's almost weird to look at that roster considering the way we thought of them even just a couple of years ago. I mean, even last year going into the season, and then to look at the roster and say, man, not a lot of holes, not a lot of like desperate needs heading into the draft, which I think is certainly a testament to the team builders there, but makes them a very interesting team to circle and follow this season. At 8.5, there are a handful of teams that I think are interesting. When we get to 7.5, I mean, like let's just like dive in. But 8.5, we've got the Seahawks there, we've got the Steelers there, who don't have a quarterback yet. Or I mean, I guess they do, but is he going to be the quarterback? The Vikings are here after a 14-win season. Then at 8.5, this is the biggest drop that we saw for a team this year. 5.5 wins less. Let's talk through that because the loss of Samuel going to JJ McCarthy is obviously a key component here. Although they made the choice to do that, which I think is an interesting part of it. It's not like, oh, we lost somebody and now we're looking for, like, they decided that they thought a better path for them was JJ McCarthy. They did bring in some people this offseason that I think kind of made the team in other ways look like they might be better than they were last year. How do you explain the 5.5 wins less total for them?
So I think as a data scientist modeling this, there's 3 items that are absolutely key. The first, as you mentioned, is the quarterback. And so I've done research on this. The average first round quarterback ends up being Aiden O'Connell. So if you're just modeling this preseason and you have no information, there's very, very limited information, which Eric Eager, now of the Panthers, used to be with us, about guys who have sat and ended up playing. Like there's a bunch of guys who have done that, but like how much of that selection bias after the first year, we have no idea what they looked like in the first year practicing, so forth and so on. And so let's just say first round quarterback average, Aiden O'Connell is their quarterback. Well, I mean, 8.5 feels pretty right if their defense is going to be really good. So that's item 1. Number 2 is you look at their Pythagorean wins, which again is like, I think technically I don't know what the exponent is, but it's looking at the differential, the point differential between points allowed and points scored. They were like 3 wins better than what their Pythagorean win total was last year. They ended up, I think, winning 14 or something like that. They were actually an 11-win team by that. And they've actually done that 2 years with KOC. And the next years they ended up faltering. Of course, Kirk Cousins ends up getting hurt, but that's just how that kind of takes. So that's a second knock against them per se, if you're just modeling this out by the averages. And then the third element, which people don't really think about all that much last year, but like their offense actually wasn't very good last year. And frankly, they've never really been awesome under KOC. They were 16th in EPA per play. Looking at success rate, they were 12th. Most critically, they were very not good in running the ball, 26th in EPA per rush. Obviously, they'll bring in Jordan Mason, who I thought had a good year and stood out in some of our metrics as well. But when you're combining a rookie quarterback, again, you're combining Aiden O'Connell or Mitch Trubisky, let's just think of it that way, with a team that overperformed last year without a good offense, becomes a struggle to say that team's going to be really good next year.
Interesting. That's a lot of losses. I mean, compared to everyone else, right?
Mm-hmm.
By the way, Bears have the same win total.
Right. And that's
coming up from a 5-win season.
It's a great segue because that's a gnarly division. I mean, like, good Lord, if the Bears are going to be an 8.5 team, there's no teams, right, with under an 8.5 win total. So like, good Lord, you're playing the best teams.
You're right. We've got the Lions at 10.5. And maybe that actually, we talked about the Lions projected to win 4.5 less games. If you're giving more wins, you're assuming the Bears are better and you're assuming, well, the Vikings are not as good. I guess that's, part of this here, but you're giving the Packers 9.5 wins. Like they're assuming that these teams are, that it's a good division. And so that probably bumps them down too.
So it's interesting right now we're assigning team to value, but like if you're assigning 32 teams with people betting on those 32 teams, what you're basically saying here is we think the Lions are going to win the division and everyone else may be a playoff team. Maybe they won't be a playoff team. So it's interesting to think about the distribution because it's basically like the full 17 games, and you have the Lions kind of over here and everyone else like at the middle or a tick behind. And that's probably a safe play, honestly, if you're looking at the entirety of what ESPN Bet or any book is trying to do here.
Bears plus 110 to go over 8.5, minus 140 to go under. Because not all 8.5s are the same, right? What would you, and this isn't necessarily betting advice, it's just, I'm trying to think about like where we land on this. Would you be thinking as far as the Vikings number, for instance, starting there? Would you like them to win more? Would you like them to win less? Like, as far as like, if this is the number we're giving you, it's 8.5 for the Vikings and all the things that you just broke down, which side of the coin would you fall on at this moment?
Given what I've said, I don't know if I would even. It's so tough because what this really hinges on is Caleb Williams. Because Caleb Williams
Vikings first. Vikings.
I know.
Sorry.
But
yes,
why I'm saying,
I got it.
yeah.
Okay.
If you're saying, and to a certain degree, JJ McCarthy as well, because if you're saying that both of them are going to be the average rookie or average second-year quarterback, then I think both of these numbers are probably spot on. But Ben Johnson's saying. Yeah, Ben Johnson's saying a lot of good things. He's out there bringing up EPA per play in front of the media and the owners. I like what I'm hearing there. But I think I'd stay away from both of these because I think this is more of a play for the book to win, to split people rather than to juice one side or the other or to, play anything there.
Which is also a worthwhile thing to point out as we have this conversation is that these numbers aren't even necessarily what the books think is going to happen. This is what they think that they can get the most even action on both sides with. So
exactly.
Sometimes they'll come up with a different number and then they'll have to change the number slightly, plus or minus, so that they can get even money roughly on both sides. That's an interesting point. So the Cardinals are also in there at 8.5. Then we get to the 7.5 win teams. And this is just like a cluster of fascination for me. You've got the Patriots and the Jaguars, who both won 4 games last year and are projected to win 3.5 games more. You've got, and also have a ton of draft capital, both teams. So there's room with which to make some changes. There's different leadership. They're making the changes as far as the Jaguars are concerned. And so maybe, I don't know that that's getting factored in, but something that we can discuss. Other teams in this 7.5 win range, the Colts, market does not look like it's buying Richardson or Daniel Jones. The Colts and the Falcons, by the way, which are another team in here at 7.5, are the only teams with losing records last year that are expected to lose more games this year than they did last year, which I think is fascinating. You've also got the Cowboys in here at 7.5 after winning 7 games last year. Now, you have been a big fan of, like, you've been saying like double-digit wins and stuff. So I would imagine that is that one that jumped out at you when you looked at this list of teams is like Cowboys. I'm going to circle that at 7.5 because I think they're going to win a lot more than that.
Yeah. So I think the two that jumped out to me for completely separate flip sides of the coin are the Cowboys and the Colts. The Cowboys, you can't you can't do the same exercise that we kind of did with the 49ers, sans the schedule, with the Cowboys and not like it, because the Cowboys have Dak Prescott, who's been in the MVP conversation 2 or 3 times in his career, though he didn't look good and he had like a catastrophic hamstring torn injury on top of the crazy broken leg that we saw a year ago. Or years ago. They have CeeDee Lamb, they have Michael Parsons, and they have a couple good pieces of their offensive line that perhaps will progress, and it did progress as the season went on last year. The numbers in aggregate didn't look very good, but at the end of the year, they looked to be really playing well, primarily behind Tyler Smith. So my general point is you can't do the same exercise as you do with the 49ers or some of these teams who slightly underperformed with really good players last year and not do it for the Cowboys. And it seems like that's what's going on here. Flip side of the coin, the Colts stood out to me because they don't have good players. Like, who do they have on that team? And they just let arguably the strength of the team, the other side of their offensive line across from Quentin Nelson, go to the Vikings. And like that was what a lot of people thought was the strength of their team. And the reason that Jonathan Taylor was able to get so many yards was because they had Kelly and Fries and Nelson leading up the middle. And I just like don't see it. Like it feels like a crash out is inbound. They're not in a fantastic position to recoup. It seems like a lot of people have them going tight end. I know there's questions about where they'll go in the draft. I just don't think this is the draft that will swing it for them at all, even given the idea that the draft isn't really going to swing it for you in year one anyway. It may swing it for you if you really do a great job in years 2 or 3. So all that 7.5 feels really high to me outside of strength of schedule stuff.
The Cowboys with the 5th toughest strength of schedule. Chicago has the 2nd toughest strength of schedule and still getting that 3.5 win boost.
Yeah, I think it's a real sign of how difficult those divisions are. Kind of both on these teams being 7.5, 8.5, 9.5. And also on the like, wow, the Cowboys are really low. Like it's kind of it both is a progression up because anything could happen. It's a regression back because there's a bunch of good players. And so, I mean, you think, can they win the division? I am one who is now betting against myself. I love Jayden Daniels. I thought he was awesome. Thought he should have won the Heisman. Thought he immediately was saying he was QB1 and all this stuff. But I can see regression happening there. Obviously, they did everything they could to make sure that's not the case. But it's difficult to be good any 2 years in a row in the NFL, particularly when last year was really like okay, we don't really know what they're doing here. Maybe they'll run the read option. Maybe they won't. Maybe they'll throw it deep down the perimeter. Now the book's kind of out of him. There's 18 games of film. Well, really more, 19, 20 games of film given their playoff run on him. So the bet for the Cowboys would be that the Commanders see at least somewhat regression down from the 12 games that they did win. You can say the Eagles are still probably going to be good and the Giants are going to be bad.
I don't know. I mean, everything you're saying about the Commanders makes logical sense. And certainly the Texans just like hanging there as a prime example of a team that overperformed in year 1 with their quarterback and then saw massive regression in year 2. I feel like the moves that the Commanders have made this offseason though have been the right ones to maximize. So even if there is a regression, you're still, I mean, their win total is still less than what they won last year, right? Like they won 12 and they're coming back to 10.5. So I feel like you're almost building that in to a degree. I don't know. The Commanders are that's an interesting one just in terms of doing the numbers for the division like you just did. The Falcons feels really interesting to me in that they're expected to win less because Cousins was pretty terrible last year. And then Penix comes in and it looks like, okay, this is going to work. We're going to work with this. This is better. At least, well, I think this is maybe the interesting conversation to have. How much better was Penix? Or was it just, it's good enough that this gives us hope that there's something that we can work with for the future? Like, was it immediately actually better than Kirk Cousins from a numbers standpoint? Are we expecting to plug him in and we're going to get a much better Falcons offensive experience than what we saw last year?
So I think if you're doing geek data science nerd stuff,
which clearly we're doing.
Which we're doing. Well, the reason I say that is because I data scientists don't want to say that it's going to be markedly better. But guy who watches a lot of football, noted that all of a sudden Zach Robinson is running an entirely different playbook that looked a lot like what he wanted to do week 1. And with that in mind, typically when an offense coordinator gets to do what he wants to do, and you have good players like Darnell Mooney and Drake London and Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier and Kyle Pitts and all these other good players, it's a win-win for them. And so I am one to think that this was one of the ones where I'm like, I kind of like the over here, like it kind of makes sense to go over here, because if you're to believe that the offense coordinator is confident running whatever he wants to run, and it's going to be a play action heavy system, and it's going to put guys in the position to win, particularly guys who we all think are really, really good, then it feels like this is going to be a successful team. Now, and they really didn't lose much. They're going to probably add an edge rusher in the draft, which may or may not swing either way, but they're in that good spot of the draft where there's going to be 4 and 5 edge rushers drafted, it feels like. Like if they're in a very similar situation as the Bengals, just without the superstar power at quarterback, I think, in that they have excellent support skill players. Their defense, probably not that good, but probably, frankly, they're probably better set up for success. On the defensive side of the ball, they're going to lose Grady Jarrett, or they did lose Grady Jarrett, similar to the Bengals may or may not lose Trey Hendrickson, but definitely lost Sam Hubbard. And so it feels like that kind of, I can see an over here is kind of my view of it.
Yeah. I think that they're a really interesting team in these numbers. There is a stat that Sports Info Solutions tracks that is not our stat. I think it's a really interesting, just in terms of like story. I'd like to dive into that a little bit more. They do a boom rate and bust rate. And I think, we're used to seeing that where fantasy is concerned. You open up your fantasy team and it's like, what is the bust probability? What's the boom probability? All that kind of stuff. This one, I think, probably tracks. And again, I'm just guessing here that when they go and they grade certain plays, much like, everybody does teams, PFF, all the grading scales that everybody's familiar with in terms of like taking a play and giving it a plus or a minus. And my guess is that they're incorporating those numbers into like busted plays and plays that were really, really successful. In terms of bust rate, Michael Penix had the lowest number for an NFL quarterback last year. Now, very small sample size, but I think since you're talking about percentages and he did start 3 games, that maybe there's enough for that rate to be interesting. And it was 10%. He also, and I think an interesting corollary with that number is he had the second highest ADOT for a quarterback that had 100 attempts or more. 10.2, that's almost 3 yards higher than Cousins had. So he's throwing the ball downfield and doing so in such a way where he wasn't busting, quote unquote, with a great deal of frequency and very low degree of frequency even. So I think that that's probably an interesting story for us with regards to him.
Yeah, and I think the whole calculus behind the move at the time going to Penix was, if you watch the Falcons a lot, it shows up in the numbers. Cousins was never an average quarterback. There were games where he was excellent, and there was games where he was really, really bad. And I think they made a decision in that they wanted to limit that downside because they knew that they could run the ball pretty well, and they knew that they had successful players on the outside that, you just need to give them a chance. And the move to Penix signaled that, number one, we're going to let our offense coordinator have a chance. Number two, we're going to limit some of those negative plays so that our guys can get more chances per se. And I think if that's the plan for success going into 2025, in my view.
Yeah. So is this the year that we finally get to see all these offensive weapons maximized, right? That they drafted maybe ahead of schedule. I think that they'll be a very interesting team to track in terms of these numbers. Working our way down the list, and there's not a lot that I want to dive into here, frankly. You've got the Saints, Raiders, and Panthers at 6.5 wins. You've got the Titans, Jets, and Giants at 5.5 wins. And you've got the Browns bringing up the rear at 4.5 wins, coming off a 3-win season. Any of those you disagree with the numbers about?
I think if you're looking at the 6.5 win teams, it's all teams that seemingly have a quarterback, but we don't know exactly what we're going to see from the quarterback. Geno, I think, is a little bit more of a lock than Derek Carr or than Bryce Young, but there's just big, massive questions. The Saints they're old on defense, and if their wide receivers gets hurt, they're immediately cooked. The Raiders is a young offensive line and just questions kind of all over the field, but now they have a quarterback who feels like a good, at least short-term fix for them. The Panthers is quarterback, a little bit of a question mark. Defense, just complete blank slate, but we know they should be able to run the ball effectively. So it's like, big question, can they answer it? And I feel kind of comfortable with all these teams at 6.5. If I had to pick a team at 6.5, it would be the Carolina Panthers. but I've made that mistake going all the way back to this time last year. So maybe, temper me a little bit on that. The 5.5 teams brings me back to the Denver Broncos. And it's basically which of these teams will have consistent quarterback play. Feels like the answer is going to be either the Titans or the Jets. Depends on, mostly because I don't know what the Browns or the Giants are going to do.
Wait, that are going to have consistent quarterback play?
If you're betting distributionally, we don't really know what Justin Fields will look like in the Tanner Engstrand offense, and then the Tennessee Titans have the number 1 pick. That's why I'm thinking that.
Okay.
I mean, unless you want to bet on our guy Jameis, which, look, I'm more than willing to bet on Jameis,
I think you're betting on Russell, aren't you?
Are we?
You think Jameis beats out Russell?
I mean, this was the whole discussion about Russ and Justin Fields last year. Do you think Justin Fields would have lost a lot more games than Russell won? That's really the question here.
But I also think that Justin is younger. I think Jameis is locked into who he is. I think there's nothing we need to still learn about Jameis. I do think it's a worthwhile conversation to have. I don't think it's a far off conversation to have to suggest, is he that much worse than Russell Wilson? I don't know. But I think that the thing with Justin Fields and Russell Wilson to me was always like, what is the ceiling for Russell Wilson? Not that high, as we saw as the season went on, especially. And then what could it be with Justin? I just feel like, and I'm not arguing that Justin is going to turn into an elite quarterback. That's not what I'm arguing, but I am arguing that I just feel like I still have yet to see him get the opportunity in the right type of offensive looks as I would like. And so if it feels like there's an unknown attached to him, whereas the opposite, that's not true for the other guys in my mind.
The stat to watch, if you're going to really love the Jets over or take a shot on any of these teams, is it's a good point, Stopsky, but
for people who are just listening, he just put up a graphic that says in our passing Sumer score, Russell Wilson's 87th percentile and Justin Fields' is 27th percentile. Okay. Fair enough.
Look, Stopsky's just trying to soothe himself over there and make Russ is coming to save you, Stopsky. I don't know. I don't know about that one. Typically, look, I'm an analytics guy. I love numbers, but sometimes you just got to go to some reputation, some resume. And I suppose this is an analytic, but when Pete Carroll lets you go, Sean Payton lets you go, and Mike Tomlin lets you go, you probably shouldn't be trusted as a quarterback. Maybe that's a crazy take that 3 Super Bowl winning coaches and typically in the conversation for coach of the year and typically winning games let you go.
That's a great point. That is a great point. That is a great point, Sam. I mean, now we're looking at a history of people who know what the hell they're talking about that have said, I'd rather do something else.
Yeah, and you look at Jameis.
What does that say?
Yeah, you look at Jameis, it's Bruce Arians, who has 2 Coach of the Years in a Super Bowl, then Sean Payton, then Kevin Stefanski, who has 2 Coach of the Years as well. And so it's like, I'm not a numbers, I am a numbers guy, I guess. That's what I like to do. I'm paid to do it at least. I don't know if I'm the best at it, but they pay me to do it and talk about it. But I'm a numbers guy, but sometimes you just got to look at the little tiny stats like that. And when you have those 5 guys giving up on you as a quarterback, you got to ask some questions.
I'd never really thought about it specifically like that. And I think that that's really well said, Sam. Another number about Russell Wilson that I thought was very interesting from last year, because the 2 numbers feel like they're roughly the same thing, but his ranking in these 2 numbers is wildly different. He ranked 12th last year in on-target rate, but 32nd in catchable ball rate. Can we have a conversation about what the fuck that means?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the breakdown of his metrics via our Sumer scores, it's all predicated on the long ball. And so, we're talking about completion percentage over expected. These are pretty low completion percentage, low probability throws, but he was very good at hitting them. And that's why he gets these big chunk plays. And that's why the stat that Sobsky brought up of, our kind of all-in-one metric, our passing Sumer score, the one that kind of encapsulates everything that's going on the field and tries to provide a value to it, is high because he was hitting really difficult throws throughout the year. The problem becomes okay, well, different team, different offensive line, probably one more talented wide receiver. But outside of that, like what were the Giants really looking at? And you start getting questions about sack avoidance, ninth percentile last year. You start getting questions about short accuracy, 22nd percentile last year. You start asking all these questions, and it was like, okay, is he a merchant of the scheme? Is he a merchant? Is that scheme going to be the same? Is that scheme going to be totally dependent on Malik Neighbors? So the bet that I would make with these guys would be more draft Malik Neighbors in your fantasy draft than Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston are taking me to the playoffs, baby.
What is different between on target and catchable? Like, how is that different? Because so it's where it should be versus it's a ball that they could catch. Like, how would you even, now we're getting into like a dorky stat conversation, but how are the stats different? How would you evaluate that differently?
I mean, typically stuff like that will end up coming down to charting, and charting is always inherently subjective for the most part.
That's a wildly different result.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to the throw profile that he had, which was a lot of deep balls. And so, if you're throwing in the right place, but the wide receiver's not getting there, then you're probably on target, but it's unfortunately not catchable. Or if someone's running and gets tied up, then you're probably on target, but it's probably not catchable. And so I think it really kind of shows the boomer bust nature.
If you're, and this is not him, but like if you're just like throwing like it with like all the gas and it's like a 5-yard throw, like,
yeah,
is that on target but not catchable? Like, could that be something that's factored in?
I think it's really kind of an interesting stat, particularly for Russell, especially in the context of the fact that he'll be with Malik Neighbors, is that the ball will probably be there. We think sack avoidance is not great at all. So, different offensive line. And that was really what held him back with the Broncos as well, was the ability to avoid stats. And like, that's really the thing that, especially looking how Bo Nix was successful in that offense last year, he did not lose a ton of EPA on sacks last year. Like, it's just a fact. And so you really have to call about the question of like, what are these two guys going to look like? Like, I just don't think you can expect even average play from both of them in unison in any combination distributionally at all. I'm saying distributionally a lot, but it's like, that's what we have to think about right now in terms of these win totals, is because like the idea of everything that can happen, what's most likely to happen and what do we think will happen could be different.
So one more guy that is worth noting with regard to these two stats. So again, Russell Wilson, 12th in on target rate, 32nd in catchable ball rate. How about this one for Dak? And you've mentioned like it was a rough year for Dak last year. Of the 47 quarterbacks that had 75 or more attempts, he had the third lowest on target rate, 68.8%. That is terrible. That is terrible. But we've already established that we've seen all sorts of different versions of Dak. So, who knows? There was some Cowboys news that came out while we were talking here from Jerry Jones at owners meeting, talking about the contract situation with Michael Parsons. Said, I don't view it as urgent at all. I'd rather pay more and get it right.
Yeah, I mean, for a guy in the oil field business, that feels a little strange. Like, you're making bets on digging 1,000,000-foot things into the crust in order to get some oil, but you don't want to bet on Michael Parsons. Look, people disagree with him. If he wants to, this is basically like buying bonds and buying stocks. Like if you don't want any uncertainty, sure, pay as much as you want, but and you'll have less uncertainty. But a
Doesn't he
lot
have
of
so
people
much
have been
evidence? So much evidence, Sam. He's done this over and over and
I'm
over
trying to
and
help. I
over.
mean, I'm
Like,
trying to stand up for my
why?
guy Jared
Why
a
are
little
you?
bit.
Why? What? What? Like, learn a lesson, right?
Yeah.
Like, don't you? At some point, you have to understand the ways in which you've overpaid. There's now a history of not just people in general, but you specifically having been taken to the cleaners because you've waited. Like, I don't understand why we're so married to staying consistent with the message here. As I feel like I'm not a Cowboys fan. I don't care. I feel like if I was a Cowboys fan, I would literally be getting like angry. Now, I would feel like I was being trolled when you have the quote is, I don't view it as urgent. Like, what do you mean? We're
I think
losing
it's
money right and left. It's
yeah.
hampering our ability to build.
I think he's coming from a place of extreme privilege, which is that the players that he is talking about are literally some of the best players in the league. Like, congratulations, you drafted guys, and you could probably pay him anything, and it'll probably be worth it. Like, yeah, Michael Parsons is a really good at rushing the passer, is going to be in the Defensive Player of the Year conversation every year. Was basically an entire defense at the end of the year last year, could win entire games by himself. Congrats. You know, you'll pay extra on him and it'll probably be worth it. Same with CD. CD for years has been one of the best wide receivers in the league, an excellent target earner, can basically be an entire offense if someone can get him the ball. And Dak, for better or worse, has led many teams to the playoffs. Like those three players, congratulations. Like no one's going to kill you if you pay them. But like at what point, you know, we got to bring up the Ezekiel Elliott contract, right?
I
Like
mean,
that's really the one. That's the one where
well,
it's
but
like,
you could
what are
argue
you doing?
even at that time, you could argue like that he is top of market and pay him and what, but when you prolong it and you get more expensive and you do go top of market and the top of market moves
Mm-hmm.
because you waited and now you're overpaying for something that is already in a running back's case if you're going to go top of market, like that's even questionable. I think that you could make the argument that him waiting and the
Yep.
amount extra that he's paying in all of these cases actually makes them not worth the number at the end of the day, because you're not paying for what they've already done to that point. You're paying them ideally for what you expect them to do on that contract. And Dak so far has not paid off his number, which
Mm-hmm.
it got higher, right?
Yep.
And so if you locked him in at the beginning, are we having this conversation to the degree that we are? Are we looking at his play through the microscope that we are? Because now you're like an averagely paid quarterback, whereas that's not the case. For Michael Parsons, are we going to do that same thing? Are we going to wait, then go top of market? I mean, the market got higher this offseason, like way higher for him. He got way more expensive than if they had signed him the second that they could have,
Mm-hmm.
a while ago before any of the rest of these guys signed. And now, is he going to be able to pay that off? I mean, probably, but we keep moving. We're moving the goalposts here in terms of what we expect them to do on the field in correlation with what you're paying them. And it's their fault.
Yeah, extremely well said. I'm playing devil's advocate here, but when you look at teams like the Eagles who do this over and over again, and then basically can add whoever they want whenever they want at a big cash, like that's what must be said though, like at a big cash loss in any given year, I suppose. But just in terms of competitiveness, they're able to do it, and they just add guys every year. You know, they can add a Saquon if they need to, and the Browns to a certain degree as well have done this. It's very hampered by the Deshaun Watson element at this point, but the ability that they can even have any chance of navigating the Deshaun Watson fallout is because they've used, pretty good cap processes for the past few years. And then if you want to look at this year, the Bills have extended every human being under the sun that they could possibly extend, and are even in the media being like, we tried to extend James Cook too, but they didn't want to play ball. Come extend. Like, we'll pay you right now, buddy. Like, come on. And so it's clear that there is a overwhelming consensus on this amongst the teams that are able to do it, which is extend your guys and utilize the other extensions that end up working out to help you when it doesn't work out in terms of a Deshaun Watson or in terms of some of these other guys.
All right, that's going to do it for our win total conversation today. We're back on Friday on Sirius XM NFL Radio with the Sumer Sports Draft Show. Sam, me, Thomas Dimitrov. That is at 7 Eastern. You can find that on channel 88 on Sirius XM. We'll be breaking down a different position group. We've already done the offensive skill positions, also known as the wide receivers, tight ends, and running backs. We've already talked about the offensive linemen. So we're going position group by position group, and we'll continue that conversation on Friday. And we hope that you'll join us for that. And we'll be back again here next week, same time, same place.
Yeah, this was a fun one. We got to talk about some games. You know, I love games. We're talking about games here.
Even went through some schedules, waiting for that schedule release, so that we can properly have that conversation.
We're like fiends right now, Lindsay. We're like, just any football, any idea that a ball will be thrown on a football field is exciting.
Oh, thanks for being with us, guys.